people who are visually impaired. And we did that one because one of our listeners, who's a kid, he writes to us all the time. He's this amazing kid. He's always sending us thoughts and ideas, but he's visually impaired. And he said, why don't we do an episode on that? And we ended up working on it with him to, explain what it's like to be a child who is visually impaired. And we've been asked a million times to do an episode on autism and neurodiversity, because a lot of the families that listen to the show have neurodiverse children that really respond very positively to the show. We always were like, I don't know, like we don't, like none of us really have direct experience with it. And finally we're like, well, why don't we just see if one of the families who has a kid who's on the spectrum would want to help? So we ended up working with a family and a child who has autism to help us write the episode. And not only just from like, what are the things that they get asked about a lot, but also just making sure that the way we were describing the experience of being that child in the episode would be accurate. So, yeah.
That is amazing. I had a question about that too, because I thought that, well, this being something that is presented in the audio format and making sure, and is trying to make sure to engage kids, keeping them entertained while educating them, it must mean a lot. It must have a lot of implications for kids who are neurodivergent, kids who are even visually impaired, to have something that is designed for their ears. Mm-hmm. What were some of the advice that you got in the process of that, or notable advice if you can recall?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things was the first scene of that episode. We wanted to set it in a classroom with a neurodivergent kid in the class. So we just really sat down with this child who helped us and asked him, what's it like? When you walk into a new space and people aren't understanding what it's like to be you, or they don't know how to engage with you, how does that feel? And how do you respond to that? And that became the basis for how we wrote that character. We actually did also do an episode on people who are visually impaired. And we did that one because one of our listeners, who's a kid, he writes to us all the time. He's this amazing kid. He's always sending us thoughts and ideas, but he's visually impaired. And he said, why don't we do an episode on that? And we ended up working on it with him to, explain what it's like to be a child who is visually impaired. And really important to us, especially if we're talking about a child's experience, to make sure we're actually correctly portraying it and not like what the adult thinks their experience is like. So that's been an important part of the show as well.
It is incredible the degree to which, and not to poop on old creations, but it is incredible the degree to which that was lacking in a lot of the kids' shows that we were watching when we were young.
Yeah.
For example, I grew up on Dragon Ball Z as well, and I was just watching Dragon Ball Z, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh man, so much of this stuff was not appropriate for us. Yeah. Or some of it was heavy play on stereotypes. Now I can still watch it and laugh at it, but they didn't take in consideration like, hey, what can a person of that background or who experiences that, how would they look at this? Because some of these shows, I remember looking at them when I was older and I'm like, ooh, that was a little bit... ooh, that shouldn't have been in a kid's show. That shouldn't have been there. That shouldn't have been a consideration. Even another one that's very basic was children's reading books. Mm-hmm. There's very few books that I have upstairs that actually makes use of phonics, but that's actually how we read. And so when they're saying A for apple, it's, A for apple. It's not apple, it's apple. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the kids reading books actually, for a long time, did not really incorporate that depth of, I don't know what's the best way to term it, whether it's, I want to say consideration, but they didn't really try to capture the experience of the listener and put themselves in their shoe and say like, okay, well, this is how we do this properly. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to slag on educational materials because I know people generally try their best to make good stuff. But I think there's a world of difference between really great educational material, whether that's a book or a video or a podcast, and just stuff that's kind of fine. And I think as a parent or educator, you know it when you see it. There's just a lot of kind of okay stuff out there, right? So when you find something that you're like, oh, this is legit, right? This is like someone really is thinking about this. Someone's caring about it. Human beings like clearly are passionate about this. That's the stuff you stick with, whether it's, like a lot of people feel that way about Who Smarted, And there's other podcasts people love. There's, video series, there's book series that when you find those as a parent or educator, you kind of really just like get really loyal to them, because there's just so much like mediocre stuff out there.
That's very true. And that's why I also like how you guys incorporated just kind of like asking the kids trivia questions within that, because my son, what he'll do, he'll pause it and he'll try to answer it himself before.
That's awesome.
Which is a hallmark of that's actually the best way of learning.
Yeah.
When we think about it.
Yeah. There's, Who Smarted, like it looks, the format is pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of not just research for this show, but years of research for other shows, the psychology of learning for kids and adults that have gone into creating these shows. And it's all kind of baked in now to how we do it, but there's a lot of thought that's gone into how these shows work. The other thing I would say is, with more and more content coming out that's AI generated, it's going to be even more obvious when you run into a great piece of human made content, where you're just like, it's going to be very clear. There might be some AI stuff that eventually comes out that's really quality and good, but I think people are already feeling, a lot of AI is just kind of like remixing stuff that humans made, and so at some point, you kind of run out of stuff to remix, I guess is the best way to put it. But we've seen, I say like even more specific, like we've actually seen AI generated podcasts and AI generated content for kids. And it's like fine, but it's just doesn't have any spark to it,
Well, I mean, think of how much goes into the making of a human brain and, all the experiences you draw from by the time that you're making the show as an adult, right? We've gone through the influences of you as a child, the shows you grew up on, as well as your experience making other shows of such nature. There's so much that goes into it that the AI only has so much to draw from. And being able to, even the idea of like, hey, what does a kid think about it? Where, I mean, it's generative AI, we get it. Like it has its limitations, but it just speaks to how amazing the human brain is in terms of amalgamating all these experiences and being able to come up with ideas. There came a point where I realized like, there's no idea that just comes out of nowhere, that comes out of a vacuum, that is our own idea originally. If we're really giving credits to people, the list is going to be lengthy,
Yeah. No, I know. That's when people like are very like ego driven around idea creation. I'm like, you've no idea where ideas come from. Either it's, like you could train your brain to be more idea oriented by keeping an open mind and, looking at other people's points of view and trying to defend other points of view that you don't agree with is a great way to keep your brain open to other things that are coming in. And, a lot of people, they really get hung up on the idea that like the idea like literally just came from them. And it's like, we live in such a interdependent universe, nothing happens that's not connected to everything else.
Absolutely.